Wow, we could just take the offering and go home. But we have to get the offering in. So I want to invite you to turn to the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. What a powerful time of worship. You know, Jesus said that the true worshipers would worship in spirit and truth. And there's something very life-giving to authentic worship. And so I hope that when you come here to the brook that you can come and you can feel that you can be yourself before God and be real before Him and truly open yourself up to Him in times of worship, that the words that you sing really mean something to you. And sometimes, you know, I come and I don't feel as the words say, but they transform me. Because my prayers are, God, that's not quite true about me today, but that's my prayer. That's what I want to be. That's what I want to feel. That's what I want to experience in you. And that's true authenticity. Is where we come as we are. Come as we are. And that's how God accepts us. So we're beginning today a message series called Restore. Restore. And I have a feeling that God is going to restore some people in this message series. You know, this whole book of Nehemiah is about his calling, his vision, and his actions that he took toward rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem was the epicenter of the Jewish faith. I mean, this was why this was so important. It wasn't the physical walls so much as what those walls meant. Because as Jerusalem went, so did the faith of the Jewish people. And the walls were torn down and they needed to be restored so that the Jewish faith could, in that remnant, also be restored. And that was Nehemiah's hope. And that's my hope for you through this message series, that as the walls of your life have maybe been torn down, that God will restore them and rebuild them in a powerful, powerful way. So I have here a stone from Jerusalem, from Nehemiah's walls in Jerusalem. In fact, I know because he signed the back of this right here. So if any of you mess up during the service, I'm going to chunk it at you. But what we're going to do is we're going to build a wall throughout this series. We're going to use, this is the first stone. The first message today is called Calling. It's the first part of rebuilding the walls and restoring our hearts. God is calling. He's called Nehemiah. He is calling some of you. He's calling some of you to a greater life. He's calling some of you to a deeper faith. He's calling some of you to a more authentic relationship with Him. And so the first thing, the first brick in the foundation of those walls being rebuilt is the one called calling. So throughout the message series, we're going to build a little wall right here as a symbol of what God is doing also in our hearts. He was born in the nation of Persia. Only hearing the stories of his fathers and his forefathers, of his ancestors, of all the great and mighty deeds that God had done in and through the nation of Israel. Let me take you back to a time 1,000 years after Abraham. A time with a little-known nation called Israel. God had given the nation of Israel 3 kings. The first king was the king Saul. Saul had a pretty good start. He had a bad finish. And then he was followed by David. David was the anointed king, and we proclaim the goodness of King David. He is the beloved king of the nation of Israel, and through him the lineage of Jesus resulted. Following David was his son Solomon. Solomon, again, had a good start, had a very, very poor finish. And toward the end of Solomon's reign, his children, all of his children, began to fight with one another. And it was really bad. So much so that the kingdom became divided at that point. There was a northern kingdom and there was a southern kingdom. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel stayed in the northern kingdom. Only 2 remained in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel. The southern kingdom called Judah. The capital city of the southern kingdom of Judah was the city named Jerusalem. Well, the northern kingdom began to drift. The northern kingdom began to worship Baal, the pagan gods of Baal. And, of course, this is where we pick up the story with Elijah and how Elijah there on Mount Carmel took on the prophets of Baal as a testimony of the fact that there was one true God in the universe. But, of course, the northern kingdom drifted, and further they drifted into this pagan worship that eventually God gave them over. And there was a nation that rose to power. It was called the Assyrian nation, the Assyrians. The Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. And the Assyrians were wicked. They were evil. In fact, they were known for breaking the legs of their captives, gouging out their eyes, and then setting them free to go home. They would hang their victims and then skin them alive. They were a terrible, terrible, punishing nation to Israel. And so the southern kingdom was praying during this time, knowing what was going on in the northern kingdom. They were praying that their fate would not be the same as the northern kingdom. And sure enough, God had kind of stayed off the Assyrians conquering Judah. But then the sun rose on another powerful kingdom, and that was the Babylonians. You've heard about the Babylonians. And their king was Nebuchadnezzar. They conquered the Assyrian nation, and they were breathing down the necks of the southern kingdom. And this, of course, during that time, before the invasion of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians, this was the time that Isaiah the prophet wrote. And he said to the southern kingdom of Judah, he said that there will be a virgin and she will give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Isaiah was giving this kingdom, who was about to be conquered, hope that there would be better days even in the midst of this darkness, and that the Messiah would eventually come. But sure enough, the Babylonians ended up in the early part of the 5th century BC conquering the southern kingdom of Judah. And King Nebuchadnezzar began deporting people from Jerusalem into Babylon. And of course, where is Babylon? We know it today is in modern-day Iraq. In fact, the capital city of Babylon is not far from the city of Baghdad. And so King Nebuchadnezzar began to deport people. So if I'm going to conquer Louisiana, let's say, and I'm going to reign over Louisiana, what I would do if I was a king in that day, I would conquer with my army. And then I would take those citizens and I would bring them to my country, and I would take my citizens and take them to their country. And that's what happened with King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. We know about this because we know that this was the fate of Daniel. Remember Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was during the time of Babylon. And Daniel was one of those young, bright, intelligent, gifted men who was transported from Jerusalem into Babylonia. And so, decades later, another kingdom rose to power who would conquer the Babylonians, and they were known as the Persians. And their king that led this conquest was Cyrus the Great. He absolutely destroyed Babylon, took all of their land, and as a result of that, he owned Jerusalem. But in 539 BC, something happens with Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is called in the Scripture in Isaiah. He is called the Anointed One because he was the first kind king that had been empathetic to the Jews since the captivity began. For 200 years, they had ruthless kingdoms rule over them, and they were in exile. Now Cyrus the Great comes to power, and in 539 he issues a decree, and he says, those of you Jews who want to go back to Jerusalem, you have permission to go back. And so what began was a great return back to the city of Jerusalem. The first return was led by a Jew by the name of Zerubbabel. Now, if you have a name like that, you've got to do something famous in your life to make up for it. And Zerubbabel led the first return back to Jerusalem. In fact, when he returned to Jerusalem, he rebuilt the Jewish temple. This was an amazing thing because it had been destroyed for decades. He rebuilt the Jewish temple and rededicated the temple in 515 BC. Well, it wasn't long after him that another trip back to Jerusalem was led by a guy named Ezra. We read about Ezra in the Old Testament. There's a book Ezra in the Old Testament, and Ezra was a priest. And Ezra returned with a group of people to Jerusalem, and his focus was the law, being a good priest. His focus was the law, and he believed that if the nation of Israel, if the nation of Judah did not follow God's law, that this would happen to them again, that they would be punished. And so his command was, come on guys, let's return to God's law. And he led that remnant of a revival. But then there was one more yet to come. And that's where we pick up today. One more yet to come. His name was Nehemiah, who would lead yet another return to the city of Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of that city. Now, with respect to Nehemiah, the only king that he knew was a king named Artaxerxes. And you read this beginning in chapter 2 of Nehemiah. Artaxerxes, kind of an odd name. It's got a lot of X's in there. Artaxerxes was the king of Persia. So let me give you a little bit of background here to understand exactly where we're coming from as we pick up this book of Nehemiah. There was, first of all, remember, Cyrus the Great. He was indeed great for the Jews. He was a good guy. Darius the First followed him. Darius the First is most known for leading the first invasion of the Greeks. Some of you have watched movies about the Persians and the Greeks and the great war between the Greeks and the Spartans that occurred. Well, the very first invasion was the Battle of Marathon. And tradition says that there was a guy who ran 26 miles from there at the Battle of Marathon all the way back and reported that the Greeks had victory. And indeed they did. They fended off the Persians that first battle. But eventually, as history tells us, the Persians eventually won. The Persians were a wealthy and powerful nation, and they were absolutely pagan. They were absolutely ruthless. So Darius the First leads this invasion of the Greeks, and then you have after him Xerxes. Literal meaning of that word is king. Xerxes. Now we know about him from the book of Esther. Not the book of Esther. The book that contains Esther and her story. How he had a beautiful woman named Esther. And she went to the king and said, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to warn him of the extermination of the Jews. And sure enough, she goes and saves the remnant of the Jews with this king Xerxes. And then what follows Xerxes is the king Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes. So Xerxes means king. Artaxerxes means great king. Here's the son trying to one-up his father. And this is where we pick up the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is serving under King Artaxerxes. He is in exile. And again, he has only heard about the stories of his fathers and his forefathers. And yet there was something in Nehemiah that said, I think I'll never forget. I'll never forget. So let's read Nehemiah chapter 1. Verses 1 through 4 is all we're going to read today, all we're going to look at today. This is what it says. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, now you can write out beside that, it would be the equivalent of April in our calendar. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year. 20th year of what? 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Now, Susa was not the capital of the Persian Empire. Susa was like a winter retreat. It was a citadel. It was essentially a fort, but it was an opulent and extravagant retreat for the king. They would have many residences, and this was one of the residences of King Artaxerxes. And so here in Susa is where the story of Nehemiah picks up. While I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me this, those who survived the exile are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. And let's just stop right there, because he goes on to talk about the process of God in his heart as a result of finding out this news. And we're going to look at that next week, the weeks to come. We're going to talk about the vision that was implanted in Nehemiah's heart at this point in time. But I want to remind you that God called Nehemiah, and God calls you and me today. He calls us to address certain needs in the world. And so I want to share with you 3 characteristics of God's calling upon our life. When God calls, what are some characteristics of that calling? First of all, I want to remind you of this. When God calls you and me, He prepares us in advance. He prepares us in advance for the calling that He has upon our lives. There was a long history leading up to this point that led to Nehemiah's calling. A long history. Nehemiah had been placed in a position of prominence in this kingdom. He was a cupbearer, we learn. We learn about that at the end of chapter 1. He was a cupbearer. You say, well, what's a cupbearer? It's a wine taster. He would taste the wine, he would taste the food of the king before it was given to the king. Why? So the king would not be poisoned. In fact, Artaxerxes may have been worried about that because his father was poisoned by someone in the royal household. He was killed. And so here, Nehemiah has gained a very trusted and reputable position in the kingdom of Persia. In fact, Herodotus, a historian, says that Nehemiah was probably the most trusted person in all the kingdom, may have even been second in command. So here's Nehemiah spending years and years and years in this place. So he had no idea what God was doing and how God was preparing him. He had no idea that the experiences that he was having was leading to something else. He had no idea that the education, that his skills, that his gifts, that all of those experiences were ultimately leading him to get a position of some kind where God could use him to accomplish His will. And that is so often true with you and me. Because we feel like the things that we're doing presently, the mundane things, the things that are in our life that we think could not be redeemed, could not be used in any way, that God could not use those things. But I'm here to say to you that God always puts us in a position to engage us in a process that eventually puts us in a position of some kind to be used by Him. And you say, well, I don't feel like I'm being used. Hold on. Well, I feel like the things I'm doing right now really don't matter. Do them faithfully. Be faithful in the small things, because God is using your faithfulness in the small things to hone you for skills that He will use to accomplish the big things. This has been so true time and time again with the heroes of the Bible. Moses spent 40 years in the desert as a fugitive. As a result of sin, he lost his life and his wealth, and he ended up tending to sheep in the desert. Halfway between the promised land and the Egypt that he had left, he was in a place called Midian. He was in between. Any of you ever been in between? In between bondage and slavery and ultimate freedom? That's where Moses was. But often those places of being in between, those times when we feel like we're just kind of on the bench, those are the times that God is preparing us for greater and greater things. It was true of Moses. It was true of Abraham. Abraham received a calling on his life late in his life. Late in his life, before God was able to use him to accomplish something great. God was preparing him. Joseph. Remember the story of Joseph. How Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sent off to another nation. And Joseph had the idea that he was just going to bloom where he was planted, that he was going to be faithful with what God had provided for him. And so there, even as a slave, even as a servant, Joseph remained faithful and ultimately trusted God's providence to lead him to the place where he would be used to save the nation of Israel. But it took years in preparation. It took years. David. King David. Remember the great story of David and Goliath, where David was sent to give his brothers food there at the battle lines when they were lined up against the Philistines. And David brings out the food, and his brothers mock him and say, "What are you doing here, little boy? You just bring us food." And David says, what's going on? And he realizes that there's a Philistine, a giant, who is coming down in the valley, who is cursing the nation of Israel. And David says to himself, who is this guy? Who does he think he is that he would curse the God of Israel? And he says, I'm going to do something about it. And so they try to strap some armor on him, but he was a young boy, probably in his teen years, and the armor was too big. And he said, forget the armor, I have my sling. And this is what he said. He said, the God who protected me from the bear and the lion will deliver me from the hands of this Philistine. What was he referring to? David was a shepherd. He had spent years as a shepherd boy, protecting sheep with a sling and a rock. And as God used him to protect the sheep with the slingshot, God was preparing him to protect the nation of Israel with that same sling. It was God using him and preparing him, even in those times when he was a lonely shepherd out in the desert. And I want to remind you that no experience in your life, no experience educationally, relationally, no hard experience and painful experience, no experience is wasted on God's calling. It's never too late. It's never too late. So when God calls, He prepares us in advance. Sometimes He does it when we're not knowing it. Secondly, when God calls, He awakens us to a need. See, everything in life was going fine for Nehemiah, right? I mean, he had a measure of wealth. He was eating the king's food, drinking the king's wine. And by the way, that's how we know that Nehemiah wasn't Baptist. Because, he was a drinker of wine. That's the rule, isn't it, Richard? That's the rule. You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't dance, you don't date the girls who do. That's the Baptist rule. And so Nehemiah was not a good Baptist. So here's Nehemiah. He's enjoying all the privileges of the kingdom. Life was going great for him, particularly being in exile. But his brother came to him, and he asked, how was the remnant? How were those few people in Jerusalem doing? And what about the city? His brother told him the truth, and that was the day that transformed his heart and his life. Everything in life was fine until he had heard the truth. And so Nehemiah, when he heard the truth, was disturbed because there was a need. And there was this immediate response in Nehemiah to say, this is not right, something must be done. And so God was calling him to meet the needs. You ever had those prayers where you're praying for a need out there? God, would you meet that need? That's really important. Would you send somebody to that person? Would you do this? And all the time while you're praying, God's just going, okay, well, how about you? How about you be the answer to your prayers? That's what happened with Nehemiah. He heard this truth, and this truth knocked him down. I mean, this truth absolutely overwhelmed him. And it was the truth about the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Now, again, why the walls? Why is that so important? Because, again, the walls in that day and age, in today's world, we think of walls, we think of it kind of negatively. Walls of separation, walls that separate people. Not so in that day. The walls of the city were very important. The walls being stable and secure meant that the city was whole, meant that the city was functioning, meant that the city was secure because the walls meant protection. And so the walls were a great symbol of the Jewish faith. As the walls went, so did the faith. The faith was not whole. The faith was not functioning. The faith was not secure. The faith was not all that it could be without the walls being in place. And so Nehemiah had a choice, didn't he? And we all do when we hear the truth. When the truth comes our way, we all have a choice. He could have hit the snooze button, slept another 10 minutes, and got up and done nothing about it. He could have flipped the channels to watch something else that was a little more comfortable. But instead, he decided he needed to do something about it, which leads to the last thing I want to share with you today. When God calls, He prepares us in advance. When God calls, He awakens us to a need. And when God calls, as a result of those two things, He breaks us to respond. He breaks our hearts. If we listen, if we don't flip the channel, if we don't hit the snooze, if we listen, we see it, we let it soak in. When the need is genuine, God breaks those who are His children to respond. He breaks our hearts. Nehemiah had only heard about others in his past who had done great and amazing things for God up to this point. Only had heard about Moses and Abraham and Joseph and David and what they did for God. And though in exile, I would suggest that David said again to himself, I will never forget the faith of my fathers. I will never forget what took place in the past, because that has defined me. And though I'm in exile, it has shaped me. And though I'm in exile, my faith is still real. And though I'm in pain and I'm in disappointment, and though I'm in a situation that just seems impossible for God to work and do anything, I will respond. You see, he knew about the 70 years under the Babylonian captivity, where the psalmist says in 137, our captors ask us to sing songs of the Lord. How could we sing songs of the Lord? It says, we sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept. They had no nation, they had no people, only remnants, only pockets. And so truth came his way, his world changed. And rather than sleep, he was broken. God broke him down. And we're going to look at how God broke him, because here it says that this experience began in the month of Kislev. Now, in chapter 2, verse 1, it talks about the month of Nisan. If Kislev is April, Nisan is December. Many, many months between those times. Many months where Nehemiah was broken, and he wept, and he fasted, and he mourned, the Bible says. And he describes his prayer there, verses 4 through the end of the chapter, of how God had broken him. And this is what I remind us of. All great works of God begin in brokenness. All great works of God. I saw Nanette George up here singing today. And Nanette's a new member of our church. And I thought about CareNet Pregnancy Center while I was sitting here. And she works with CareNet. And I thought to myself, I guarantee you, CareNet Pregnancy Center, who helps unwed mothers, who ministers to them, who loves them, and gives them things that they need, and help and counsel and advice, I guarantee you that ministry started because someone's heart was broken for those unwed mothers. All great works of God begin with brokenness. John Wycliffe in the 14th century was broken. He was broken by the need that people needed to read the Scriptures in their native language. And so in the 14th century, apart from opposition from the church and from the Pope, he began to translate from the Latin Vulgate into English the Bible. And he got in all kinds of trouble. Ultimately was successful doing so. He was put on trial. He was maligned. He eventually died. 44 years after his death, the Pope dug up his bones and ground them into dust and scattered them in the river. You're talking about somebody hating somebody else, right? I mean, he absolutely hated John Wycliffe. But today, the great movement of the Scriptures being able to be read by common people, which the church was against, began with a man who was broken, named John Wycliffe. When God calls, He prepares us in advance. When God calls, He awakens us to a need. When God calls, He breaks us to respond. I wonder what you're broken about this morning. Every one of us, please hear me. Every one of us who are believers have a history and a past and gifts and abilities that God can redeem to meet a need in the world as a result of us looking at the need, seeing it, and then being broken about it. Every one of us. What's your calling? What's your calling? What truth is coming your way that you need to heed? What need is there in the world that's tailor-made for you? It's just tailor-made for you, that God has something in this world, a need in this world, that He wants to meet through you and begin to meet through you. And He's going to use who you are and the pain of your past and the disappointments and the hurts and your experiences to meet that need only if you'll see it and be broken about it. And then, of course, after that comes the courage to respond. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. We're going to talk about the courage to respond to the needs of the world. When's the last time you were broken over a need? When's the last time you didn't flip the channel? When's the last time you didn't hit the snooze? When's the last time you looked squarely at a need and asked yourself the hard question, God, are you calling me to be an answer to these people's prayer? I absolutely believe that God is calling some of our people to greater things. And I don't know what that looks like. But I believe that God is calling some of you to missions. And as wild as it may seem, God is wanting you to go to places that you never, ever thought that God would call you. And we're going to look at through Nehemiah how when God called, Nehemiah responded, but then God resourced it, that God provided for the calling in a very, very powerful way. God is calling you, and you're saying to yourself, well, I can't go because I don't see the resources or I don't see the future. It's not all laid out for me. The important thing is to go, is to be willing to go, to be broken. And then step by step, in the faith walk of implementing vision, step by step, God will provide. It's going to be so powerful to see that because it was a faith walk. It was a daily walk. It was actually a walk in the minute. We're going to read in chapter 2 about Nehemiah when he was addressing the king. And the king said something to him, and Nehemiah just shot up a prayer right there on the spot. I mean, God was about to provide something, and he was responding in faith. And it's almost a moment by moment, day by day response where you say, God, I'm going to do today what you've called me to do. What is He calling you to? Will you listen? Will you heed? Will you get in on the great adventure that God has for you? Let's pray together.